people don't know about lost causes. Mr. Payne does. He said once they were the only causes worth fighting for. And I'm gonna stay right here and fight for this lost cause, even if this room gets filled with lies like these.
Well, that clip about says it all. Fighting for lost causes in Washington. That's the topic of this week's Strategy Memo. I'm Rich Tafel, president of RLT Strategies, and each week I will answer a question from a world-changing leader about strategy. And this one comes from Barbara in Manhattan. And she says, both Obama and the Republicans have bad-mouthed pork spending. Can you define it, and do you think it will continue as usual? Is this part of the lobbying you have referred to in your earlier broadcast? Well, before I answer the question, let me just say this about Barbara, who asked the question, and I know well. Barbara is exactly what I'm talking about when I talk about a world changer. She's been a champion for civil rights in New York. She then went on to be a champion and a voice for orphans in New York, took that same cause to Africa and fought for kids there, and today she works in the city government fighting for people to get health care. So Barbara, you are a world changer, and I really appreciate the question coming from you. And it's a complicated question, and it might feel like a lost cause when you're a nonprofit. You might feel a little bit like Jimmy Stewart fighting on the floor of the Senate, right, like he was, and there's no hope to get funding for your program. Well, let me address what pork is. Pork is the reference that politicians like to use about wasteful government spending. And the funny thing about pork is, what is pork to me might be a job, a school, or a hospital to you. It might be your highway, might be my pork. But the spending that I get from the government, I don't look at as pork. So pork is always a good political, rhetorical device because it's always about somebody else, not about me changing. And that's why you hear politicians talking about it. In very technical terms in Washington, pork is often referred to as earmarks. You may have heard that expression. And very quickly, an earmark is when you avoid the authorization process. In other words, your funding is not written into law, but it's given through an earmark, which means that the appropriators, the funders in Congress, give the money directly. Oftentimes, there's no oversight, there's no committee hearings, and it's just done for people in their district. So in a nutshell, that's what people refer to as pork. I'll be one of the few people you'll ever hear defending earmarks, because one of the upsides of earmarks is if you're a small nonprofit out there in the country, you can't afford the lobbying team and the voice in Washington that would create a law that would get funded. You might need to get an earmark from your senator or your congressperson. So there is actually a good side to earmarks, and you'll probably only hear it here on this email message that you're getting today. Now, the question you also ask, is this a good time to try to get it for a nonprofit? There are four huge forces at work right now. One, we've just passed the stimulus package, which is the largest government spending in years. So that's a factor. Two, we've been at war and we're still at war. Another factor. Three, the president says he's going to cut the budget in half in 4 years. So all those factors coming in. And then the fourth element is that we are in an economic crisis of unparalleled proportion. When you take all those factors together and you realize that much of our spending in our budget each year is entitlement spending, there's no real control over it, and the baby boomers are retiring, we are in a very tight environment. So is this a good time for a nonprofit to try to get funding? I would say it's not a great time, it's not an easy time, but it doesn't mean that you shouldn't do it. If you're a nonprofit and you're seeking government funding, the approach that I suggest is to use what in the business world is called return on investment. When a business is making an investment in something, they expect to get a more dramatic return. And the taxpayers are going to be asking those same questions of nonprofits. So gone are the days when a nonprofit could simply go to government and say, we're a good cause, give us money. Those days are gone. But social spending through the nonprofits is actually some of the best return on investments for taxpayers. Let me give a very quick example. I work with a group that helps kids get into college. By investing a relatively small amount of money in a low-income student in their high school years, if that student goes to college, it's $1 million more over their lifetime. And that's taxes, and it's good for the young person's whole life. The flip side is also true. We know if a student doesn't graduate from high school, they're very likely going to be on social welfare programs and also could very likely even be in our judicial system. So the return on investment argument, I think, is the best argument for nonprofits to make, whether it's on homelessness or healthcare. We have to make a case that it is good for the taxpayers' dollars. I think that's going to be the key in getting funding. The bottom line to keep in mind for people like you, Barbara, who are doing the battle for people who don't have a voice, Washington has a lot of voices asking for money. The people that you're working for in the nonprofit community might seem like the lost cause, but the truth is they don't have a voice in Washington. They don't have a voice in the political structure or your state capital. You have to be a voice for the voiceless. So that's why I think it's not just a luxury to be involved in public policy. I think it's a necessity if you want to be a world-changing leader. I look forward to your feedback and I look forward to your questions next week.